Professor Salim Mansur joins me once again to discuss the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Salim, your recent Substack article titled Falsus in Uno, Falsus in Omnibus brought to light several notable, yet overlooked, facts about the establishment of the State of Israel. One such gem was a quote from Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, whose writings in 1896 motivated European Jews to colonize Palestine. And the quote that struck me and yourself from the article and from his pamphlet goes like this, and I'll just read it so that we can get a good sense of it here. Quoting Herzl, "If we wish to found a state today, we shall not do it in the way which would have been the only possible one 1,000 years ago. It is foolish to revert to old stages of civilization, as many Zionists would like to do. Supposing, for example, we were obliged to clear a country of wild beasts, we should not set about the task in the fashion of Europeans of the 5th century. We should not take spear and lance and go out singly in pursuit of bears. We would organize a large and active hunting party, drive the animals together, and throw a melanite bomb into their midst." Now, at the time when he penned that in 1896, the decision to colonize Palestine was still to be determined. I mean, Argentina was also on the list. And of course, you have to put it in the context of the world events of 1896 and the Zionist movement and Herzl's own background. Nowhere in his book does he mention Arabs. He mentions Christians and Palestine, but he never mentions Arabs, which I think is telling. It's almost as if they're persona non grata, right? Or race non grata, without any status. Now, that being said, though, do you take this attitude of Herzl as portrayed in that one quote to be shared or to be an exemplar of today's Zionists who wish to flout the United Nations, flout the global community by occupying the West Bank and driving the Arabs out of Gaza?
Yes, I mean, that quote, again, you read that quote, it's a quote that is not taken into account by most commentators, and I put it in my paper right at the head. So again, the context of that quote, it is about emptying the land. The reference to bears are the reference to the people. So the people on the land are bears. Why not call them who they are? Arabs or, whatever ethnicity that Herzl imagines they are. He doesn't call them because this is the age in which he's writing, the high noon of European imperialism, in which the continents outside of Europe, particularly Africa and adjacent to Africa, is a dark continent. The people in the dark continent are people very close to being beasts or are beasts. And going into the dark continent is traveling into the heart of darkness, as in Joseph Conrad's famous little novella, which, by the way, was published about the same time in 1899. So this is the language that Herzl is using, that how are we going to empty the land? Because the previous quotation that you have read, you read the quote that I have in my paper, but that quote I have in my paper follows what is the plan. And the plan is that Herzl is saying, let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. The rest we shall manage for ourselves. In other words, he is making a plea to the European great powers. The Zionists are nobodies, except there's few scattered individuals like Herzl.
He also mentions in his same book, Salim, he compares the colonizing by Jews of an area, whether it's Argentina or Palestine or Uganda, to a civilizing force versus the existent barbarians.
That's
He
right.
mentions that civilization versus barbarians.
Well, that's it. I mean, this is the European Jews. European Jews, according to Herzl, pose a problem to the European powers. That's the Jewish problem, the Jewish question. And together, we, the European Jews and the European powers, can solve the problem of Europe. You, European powers, give us or grant us a portion of the globe, and we will manage it. We
He's
will,
playing on their anti-Semitism. He's saying, okay, you don't want us here? There's a
yeah,
Jewish problem, a Jewish question. Well,
yeah,
if you don't like us here, then send us elsewhere.
yeah. Just grant us a land and send us elsewhere. We will get out. You will solve your problem. We will have a state.
And it
So
happened.
that's what I call the scam, because by itself, the Jews they are European. They're assimilated or they're living in the Pale, Eastern Europe. Most Jews, look, Herzl was born in 1860. That is about the middle of the 19th century. Europe has gone through upheavals since the French Revolution. Empires are being transformed into nation states, and nation states are coming around. This is the age of European nationalism. And Herzl is born in 1860. As he enters into young adulthood, um, the nationalist forces are engaged both in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in former part of the Holy Roman Empire, which is Italy, in Germany, and the one which captivates the mind of most people in Europe at that time, the contemporaries of Herzl, is the Risorgimento, the rebirth of the Italian nation. Garibaldi and Mazzini leading the campaign to unite Italy into a nation state, and it happens. It happens in the 1880s. So it's all happening in front of Herzl. Herzl is born in 1860 in Budapest, Hungary, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to parents who are well-to-do parents. His father, Jacob Herzl, is a banker and a businessman, a very successful banker and businessman in Budapest. His wife, Janet Herzl's mother, is an assimilated U.S., leaning towards Germany, fascinated with German culture and German history. The large bulk of Central European Jews are being Germanized, and they move from Budapest to the capital, Vienna, which is where Herzl then later on goes to university, joins the university. So all around him, there are things in motion, philosophically, things in motion economically, things in motion in terms of science and engineering and development taking places. The locomotive, for instance, has come around and other things are happening. But most importantly, Europe is the seat of empires. And these empires are no longer simply limited to Europe. They are global in nature. The British Empire, Britain, by the time Herzl is a young man, the British have conquered India. And, you know, um, Britain has become an empire in which the crowned head of Britain, Queen Victoria, she is the empress now. She's declared an empress. She's no longer the Queen of England. She is the Queen of England, but she is the empress also. So this is the age of empire, the high noon, as I say, of European imperialism. Within this, eruptions that are taking place, massive changes that are taking place in Europe. Herzl comes around and talks about uh, anti-Semitism, the Jewish problem. But Herzl is not alone. There are others who have been talking about the Jewish problem. Very famously, Marx has talked about Jewish problem. Karl Marx is one of his famous essays called The Jewish Question. Others have talked about it, the Jewish problem. The question is about assimilation. The question is about secular Europe. Secularization is taking place, the separation of religion and state. All of these things are happening at the same time. And Herzl is in the midst of it. Herzl grows up as an assimilated Jew. What does that mean? He's simply culturally a Jew, nominally a Jew. He's not a practicing Jew. His parents are not practicing Jew. They're not religious Jews. And in fact, Herzl is, as a young man, he becomes an atheist. So where does this whole notion of his Jewishness comes around? That again is another fascinating story and history, excuse me, that happens. And that is the famous Dreyfus case, Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred Dreyfus was a captain in the French army. This is after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And Herzl, as a young man, has arrived in Paris for an Austrian paper to report on European affairs. And the affair that turns out to be the one which captures the imagination of the French people is the Dreyfus trial. And Herzl is in Paris reporting about this. And Dreyfus being a Jew, this became scandalous that here was a Jewish officer in the French army who was a traitor to the French nation, to the French country, to the French Grand Army. But nothing has been proven. So the case goes in, and Herzl is reporting the case. Finally, the court finds Dreyfus guilty and sends him away for a life imprisonment to a remote island in the Atlantic, southern Atlantic, the Devil's Island, which is a penal colony, and deports him. And Herzl is, among others, outraged as what has happened. And this is his moment of epiphany that here is the problem in France and in Europe, because both France and Central Europe, that is Western Europe, had gone through its revolution, its process of secularization, its emancipation, and were supposed to be the advanced democracies in Europe. And yet here they go around and indict a man because of his religious background and who he is, and call him a traitor. And this is the moment that leads Herzl to rethink what has been or being discussed among a certain elements of Jewish intellectuals in terms of the Jewish problem. And he comes up with his book, The Jewish State.
Now, could it be possible, Salim, that when he's talking about clearing the land of bears, and he does say bears, he doesn't say Arabs, he doesn't say Argentinians. Now,
Yeah, he
he's
could say,
also very well aware that wherever he goes, obviously there's going to be people there.
right.
Although he's talking about the vast tracts of land in Argentina, which are not highly populated, they're sparsely populated. As a matter of fact, some of them are still to be tamed. So could it possibly be that Herzl was actually speaking literally and talking about, like we wouldn't go into the land, the untamed wilderness, and pick off the bears one by one with lance and spear. We would corral them and throw a Mennonite bomb in there, and we'd clear that land pretty darn quick. Could he have literally been talking about wild animals rather than people?
Well, it could be, but you don't empty the land of wild animals or animals. You empty the land of people if you're going to colonize it, particularly if it is a colonial movement, a settler colonial movement based on ethno-nationalism. The Jewish state is for the Jews only, exclusively for the Jews, right? Because the Jews, whatever number they are in Europe, is barely 1.1, 1.2% at that time of the European population. And the majority of the Jews are still in Eastern Europe, just the Pale of Settlement, which, if you want to talk about it, that's the western part of Russia, the Baltic states, and Poland that constitute the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews have been confined, sort of, and where they exist. So the largest number of Jews are in the Pale of Settlement, and then the Jews in Western Europe, in Austria, Hungary, in Germany, in Netherlands, and in England and France. Remember, the Jews had been expelled from Spain at the end of 15th century, just as the Arabs were expelled after 1492, the reconquest of Spain. The Jews had been expelled from England in 1290. The Jews only returned to England after Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. They were expelled in the 13th century, and they returned when the ban on the Jews were lifted in the 17th century, end of the 17th century. So there have been expulsions, and then there have been return. But we are now in the 19th century, in the age of nationalism, in the age of secularization and so on, modernization. And what Herzl in his book is laying out is the demand for a Jewish state. There it is. The title of the book is The Jewish State, So the Jews who are in the Western half of Europe, they are assimilating into the European state. They are French Jews, English Jews, and Dutch Jews, German Jews, and Austrian Jews. Then there are the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, and predominantly the Jews of the Pale of Settlement are religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, because they're the Jews living in ghettos. They're not emancipated to come out and live in the common population of the places. Herzl's demand is for a Jewish state. This whole notion comes around as a result of the Dreyfus case. The Jews are not even secure in France. That is his argument, And so he's asking, so you have a problem? Well, we'll solve your problem together. You have a problem? You help us, find us a piece of land, a portion of the globe, and we will move there and we'll not create any state, we'll create the Jewish state. So what about the people who are non-Jews over there? That is the Gentiles, the Goyim, the beasts. Well, we're going to empty the land. In other words, a Jewish state, by definition, here, if you want to get into the definitional issue, the definitional issue is that a Jewish state is an exclusive state. A Catholic state would be an exclusive state.
He does talk about Christians. Now, he's really pushing the Palestine argument. He said that would be the preferable of the two because of the motivational element, because of the history of the area and Judaism. However, when he's talking, let me just quote you another couple of quotes, which might go against that argument that he's going to clear the land. He says, and I'm quoting, "We shall not occupy the territories by force, but we shall establish a state by legal methods. We shall purchase the needful land at a reasonable price." And again, Herzl, in another chapter, the following chapter, says, "Each man will be as free and undisturbed in his faith or his disbelief as he is in his own nationality. And if it should occur that men of other creeds and different nationalities come to live amongst us, we should accord them honorable protection and equality before the law." And he goes further by saying that in particular in Palestine, he would make those areas predominantly Christian, exterritorial, and guard them, give them a place of honor outside of the territory of Israel, and make sure that they're not molested. Again, it's a sort of insinuating an Arab revolt without saying it. But these comments from Herzl sort of belie the notion that he wants to clear the land of anybody who is not Jewish, don't you think?
Well, look, I mean, in 1896, he's imagining these things, you know, and he wants a Jewish state for European Jews. Now, you might say it's a work in progress. It's simply the kernel of an idea.
When I was reading it, it's almost like, how should we colonize Mars? And most of the book is pretty dry because it outlines economic plans, labor distribution, things like that, which are a blueprint for how do you go about colonizing a place. So that's dry. What motivates me and interests me and you are getting into the mind of the man and the motivations based on religion, anti-Semitism, ethnicity, things of that nature are very fascinating.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, why anyone should look at Herzl and Herzl's book is to look at the origin of the idea of where we have arrived at. I mean, I didn't arrive at where we are without someone else doing something that brought us into this world. And then there is a whole arc of development that takes place, right? So for anyone serious enough, I mean, all that the argument that is going on right now as a consequence of where the state of Israel has arrived, that it is engaged in plausible genocide, if not genocide itself. The argument is also that this is nothing new, that in fact, ethnic cleansing, which is part of the continuum that leads to genocide or is genocide, has been going on since the beginning of last century, that is, after the end of World War I and the imposition of the Balfour Declaration into the Palestine Mandate. Okay? So to understand all of that, at least you got to look at the architect of this idea and then flush out the history.
As a matter of fact, Ben-Gurion, when he declared in 1948 on Rothschild Boulevard, by the way, that Israel was independent, if you look behind him, there's a portrait of Theodor Herzl behind him. He is the Karl Marx. He is, the driving force behind the creation state of Israel, and his acknowledgement by having a portrait of him hanging behind Ben-Gurion as he declares independence is not gone unnoticed.
No, but you ask any Israeli, the father of the nation state of Israel is Herzl. So it is not something that you or I or anyone else is proposing and imposing. It is a fact. Herzl is the George Washington or Simon Bolivar or whoever you want to pick out the name, Garibaldi of the Jewish state. His book is The Jewish State. He is the first man who proposes that. He is the man who organizes the World Zionist Organization and starts off the conferences. The first conference was in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, and then series of conferences take place. That's the organization whose founder is Herzl that leads on to the making of the state of Israel through the Balfour Declaration.
All I'm saying, Salim, is that he seems to be a man of contradiction if, on the one hand, we get a glimpse that, first of all, he doesn't mention Arabs, even though he wants to be in Palestine, doesn't mention them at all. And then there's this passage about clearing the land by corralling the beasts and throwing in a Melanite bomb. But then the contradictory arguments is like, we're not going to use force, and anybody who has a different religion can live amongst us in peace. What I'm saying is that could this be an example of that old adage? And you know Shakespeare, you've acted Shakespeare, you're a scholar of Shakespeare. The devil can cite scripture for his purpose.
Yeah.
Taken from The Merchant of Venice, as you might realize. We pick and choose segments, to further our own cause. So might be a little disingenuous to single out that thing, that quote about clearing the land with a melanite bomb and suggesting that we forget the rest of it?
Well, I mean, my critics, if you're saying personally me, my critics are going to say that. You know, the Zionists are going to say that to the responses. Well, what is Miss Bibi Netanyahu and others doing right now?
They're clearing the land with melanite bombs.
Exactly. And there's ton of literature out there. What have they been doing? I mean, read Ilan Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that goes way back to before 1948. So, but the more relevant fact, apart from that sort of backhanded criticism, the relevant fact is, I mean, here you have the book in hand, I have the book in hand, and it is, the quote is from that section of his book called The Plan. The title of the chapter is The Plan. And what is the plan? The plan is, as I read a little while ago, to the European powers, give us sovereignty over a portion of the globe. All right. And we will do the rest. So the rest, you can say, there's a list of what is the rest he is going to do, or his organization is going to do. Well, he, right at the top of the list of things that he's going to do is, one of the things at the top is clear the land by throwing melanite bombs. Then among the list are the other things that he would do. As you read it, you know, we are going to create a state that will be some sort of a democratic state, that there will be freedom and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's a whole thing. And then you see on the economic side, he's looking for money so that he can buy land. So he is going to be going on trying to create a purse of several £100 million that he can buy land wherever the imperial powers help him locate a portion of the globe. All of these are from his book. That is his mind. But then the critical fact is that he dies in 1904.
Yeah. Can you talk, your
In
article,
1904, what is his legacy? He leaves behind a world Zionist organization with a blueprint, that is, to get a land in Palestine.
and it worked out, I mean, for the Israelis. But your article, Falsus in Unum, is very complex and very long, but
yes,
there's so much depth of information in there, and it's very dense. One of the things that I picked out, which intrigued me, was the King Crane report. It's suppression by the Americans. It was an official government commission designed to find out the sentiment of the people living in Palestine at the moment before Israel, to see what they wanted. Can you tell us about the King Crane report?
right. So, but it just doesn't come from nowhere. It is all part of a unfolding of the drama that happened, that led to World War One. And in the context of World War One, what then occurred? In the context of World War One, a point came in which the British government came up with the Balfour Declaration to get the Americans involved. Okay, so the Americans were involved. President Wilson took America to war in 1917, April, after having won the election or re-election in 1916 by promising America will not go into war. You know, so there it is. America goes in. That going into the war changes the dynamics of the war, which leads to then the armistice, a ceasefire. Germany basically wants a ceasefire, you know, an armistice. And an armistice was brought about, and eventually that armistice would be formalized. And so a peace conference was called. And that peace conference takes place in 1919 in Paris. That's the Paris Peace Conference, or the Treaty of Versailles. And Out of the Treaty of Versailles and the peace conference, a number of things develop. But we are now focused on the question of Israel and Palestine. What happens is that at the Treaty of Paris, at the Conference of Paris, where the Treaty of Paris is drawn up, the Covenant of League of Nations is also integrated into the Treaty of Paris. Because President Wilson, one of his demands was, as he went into war, demand with his own people, that is the Americans, to the American Congress to declare war, and then taking that demand into Europe, that after the war was the 14 points declaration, that is self-determination of the people in the empires that were the central powers that was fighting against the Allied power. The central powers were Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Turks. Okay, and Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay. So at Paris in 1919, once the League of Nations was established, the covenant, which is similar to the Charter of the United Nations, the Covenant of the League of Nations was signed. Article 22 of the covenant is about how the lands of these empires are going to be demarcated. Self-determination will take place of the people. And so the Turkish Empire, by definition, Turks, they controlled the empire, but they were not Arabs. The biggest population within the Turkish Empire in the Middle East were Arabs. Okay, so what will happen to the Arabs? There were all sorts of designs of post-Turkish Empire in the Middle East that had been drawn up by the British and the French in secret. But the covenant of the League that they signed on to at 1919 in Paris, there will be no secret negotiation, no secret agreements, no secret treaties. It has to be open and transparent. Okay, and so it was agreed upon that a commission, a League of Nations commission, would go to the Turkish Empire, the Arab parts of the Turkish Empire, the 1919 Inter-Allied Commission on the Mandate of the Turkish Empire. That's the whole title, but it is referred to as King Crane Commission. Why? Because the commission was made up of two principal delegates with their supporting staff. Both of them were Americans, nominated and accepted by the League, nominated by the president while he was in Paris in June of 1919, and agreed upon by the League. And they were Henry King, who was a president of Oberlin College in Ohio, and known to the president because the president himself was an academic. You know, he had been the president of Princeton University before he became governor of New Jersey, and then he became president in 1912. And the other person was Charles R. Crane, also closely associated with the president, but he was a businessman or came from a business background, Wall Street. And so these two men were nominated to take the mission, the King Crane Commission, on a open hearing of what the people of the Turkish Empire, the Arab people of the Turkish Empire, that is the Middle East, what do they want? What do they say? Okay, and so that commission was preparing its report by traveling through, calling for open hearings, having open hearings in places like Damascus, in Haifa, in Jaffa, in Jerusalem, Aleppo, and so on and so forth. And they came back and they were going to present the commission report at the end of August, and they did. The official King Crane Commission report was released at the end of August, 28 August 1919, if my memory serves me. And I cite that commission report and I cite what is in that commission report. And the long and the short of it is the commission says to reject the whole idea of the Balfour Declaration, that the commission does not support this idea because overwhelmingly, the people in the region where they have gone and heard from the people, from the delegates, official and unofficial, is against the idea of establishing a Jewish state under the Balfour Declaration in the region, in Palestine. And then both King and Crane listed a whole number of reasons. It's a very dense report from which I cited the abstract that you have read. And among them, he said, look, we spoke to the British Army, we spoke to the officers, the generals, the colonels, and everyone unanimously agreed that this project cannot be fulfilled without a huge standing army over here to implement it. Well, how many men would you need? The commission asked. Well, we would need in excess of 50,000 men. You know, that's several division. A war has ended in which the very blossom of the European youth have been massacred. And now they're going to send 50,000 British and French or maybe American soldiers into Palestine to, organize this mandate, the Balfour Declaration. They said, no, this shouldn't happen. What about the religious argument? Well, the religious argument was the Jews would be the least acceptable to both the Christians and the Muslims to manage the holy sites, the sacred places in Palestine to all three religions, because, and there I quoted him, that the sites that are sacred to the Christians are an abomination to the Jews. The sites which are sacred to the Christian are also sacred to the Muslims. And therefore, through the history, the Muslims have been the guardians because the Christians were divided and the Jews. So the Muslims have been the guardian because the Muslims treat all the sites of Jews and Christians and Muslims as sacred. And so they have been the guardian. To give it to the Jews would create a huge problem.
What struck me was the disparity in population between the indigenous, if you want to use that word, Jews,
right,
in the area in question,
right.
and the population relative to that of Arabs. Can you tell us what that was?
Well, exactly. So the census figure that they had, I mean, the ones that I cited to you came from both the English sources and from the sources that the census that were taken during the Turkish Empire. So at the time the war happened, that is the period 1914, 1918, the last credible figures that were available in Palestine itself was 700,000 Arab Palestinians. It didn't break it down into Christian and Jews, but the number was 700,000. A substantive number of Christian, but a majority would be Muslims. And the Jewish population was somewhere around 65,000. So it was a tenth, 1/10 or less of Jewish population in Palestine, in contrast to the Arab population, Christians and Muslims. Then further refinement or opinion of that population on the Arab Muslim Arab Palestinians, like Arab Christians and Muslims, there was a unanimity of rejecting the idea of the Balfour Declaration. But on the Jewish side, it was a minority opinion because the majority of the Jews in Palestine who had arrived there during the Turkish Empire uh, from the Pale of Settlement were religious Jews, and they had nothing to do with Zionism. As I pointed out, um, Zionism was barely supported by 1% of the Jewish population in Europe, European Jews. No, it was not something that had any substantive support. 1% is totally negligible. And that same 1% or less was the view of the Jews in Palestine. So the Crane Commission report did the factual study of the situation by visiting Palestine after the war and taking the time to travel through the major townships and cities and calling the people to come and present their opinion. And then they put it together, and that's the King Crane report. But the King Crane report got suppressed. And the question is why? And the answer is that not only there was the Paris conference taking place in 1919, where all of this thing was happening, there was also in America a midterm election had happened in 1918. The ceasefire was in November of 1918 in Europe. That's November 11, if you remember. That's the Remembrance Day that we mark now. But that was the ceasefire, the Armistice Day. Originally, it was the Armistice Day, November 11. But November was also the midterm election in America. And in that midterm election, the Democrat Party, which is the party of President Wilson, lost the Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, to the Republicans. And now, as the Paris Peace Conference proceeded and the treaty was on the table and countries were signing the treaty, 44 member states, they signed the League Covenant in June of 1919. Well, America couldn't sign it because the Constitution requires the treaty has to be voted in the Senate. A president can negotiate a treaty, but the Senate has to vote upon it. And a two-thirds majority is required for a treaty to pass the Senate. And with the Republican majority, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, now in the chairman of both the Foreign Relations Committee and the majority leader in the Senate, was not going to go along with the treaty. He was not going to involve the Americans in European affairs. So you might put it in a nutshell. The Democrat President Wilson, was engaging with the world and wanted to be engaged with the world. He was the man who was going to bring peace to the world. The Republicans, on the other hand, were following George Washington. Don't get entangled in the affairs of the world, That was his farewell address. Don't be a party with any of the other states in the world or any other organization in the world. You are Americans, you look after America, and the Constitution was set accordingly. So the Republicans denied President Wilson the vote to become a member of the League of Nations and to adopt the League's covenant. So the King Crane Commission, which was basically a commission sent by the League, but led by two Americans because it was nominated by President Woodrow Wilson, when they came back and when all of these things were going on, President Wilson left to come back to America. The report got suppressed. But it was not only got suppressed because the Americans no longer was going to be the member of the League of Nations. They were now going to hold that position, which is called an observer status, diplomats going into league meetings as observers, but not as member state. Um, the power was now in the hand of what is called the Executive Council. And the Executive Council comprised of the Allied powers at the end of the war: Britain, France, Italy, and America. And suddenly America is no longer there. So it is Britain, France, and Italy. And they decided, if you read the paper, the quote, the famous quote is from Balfour. It doesn't matter what the people think. It doesn't matter, what is their opinion on the matter of Balfour Declaration. It is, we decide. And this is what he said. This is what he said. Let me read the quote. In Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country, though the American Commission has been going through the form of asking what they are. So that's the reference to the King Crane Commission. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long tradition, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. So it was a back of a hand dismissal. We don't care. This is the age of empire. This is
They wanted to be rid of the Jews. They wanted their final solution was Israel. This is my estimation. Here they were given an opportunity because of the mandate in Palestine that England had, or Great Britain had, to parcel out a chunk of land, regardless of what the indigenous people there thought, shift as many Jews out of Europe there as they could because they're Jews and we don't want them. So, everybody else but damned, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter King Crane, doesn't matter the Arabs, doesn't matter even the Jews who are opposed to nationhood. We're going to set up this area. And ironically, when we go back to Herzl's quote that I first opened with, where he said, we would organize a large and active hunting party, drive the animals together and throw a Melonite bomb in their midst. Could that have been what Balfour or the Americans be thinking in the back of their mind that, oh, let's put all the Jews together in one area, right? So that they're out of our hair and somebody else's problem. I mean, I'm just speculating here, but it seems a little plausible.
Yeah, you can do all that anybody, collectively, individually can carry on speculating. There is no longer Herzl there, right? He died in 1904. That is 13 years before the Balfour Declaration was made, and now we are in 1919 and going forward in time, and there's a whole different scenario. So yes, but the facts that cannot be disputed are the land is not empty. And for every one Jew, there are 9 non-Jews, Arabs. So where are the other Jews going to go? The land is not empty, and there is no population. For a state to exist, there are 2 things that are essential: territory, 1, and population, 2.
Now, mind you, let's not jump the gun here and suggest, for example, that the 700,000 population that King Crane were talking about, or at least the statisticians of the time were talking about, that was from the river to the sea, from what is now Lebanon down to Egypt, I believe. That was that whole area. But that chunk of land that the United Nations gave to be Israel did not include everything. It included slivers and chunks here and there. There was even an Arab enclave in Tel Aviv.
700,000 is what was defined as British Palestine Mandate.
That's my point. Yes,
that was being given. in my paper, you have the map over there, because what happened was the land east of the river, the land east of the river was handed over to the
Syria.
Jordanian, that is the Emir of Jordan,
Mm.
and out of it emerge the kingdom of Jordan and then the state of Jordan that exists. Okay, but those were Arab lands. I mean, and the Arab lands, and the population was Arab population, just as Arabia's further south, or Mesopotamia that was turned into Iraq and so on. So these were this was the Arab land of the Turkish Empire. So that number, the numbers from those places are not included in the 700,000. The 700,000 is the Arab population in what was being designated as the Mandate of Palestine. You see, and that is again from river to the sea. That is the River Jordan to the sea. Okay.
See, I'm looking at your map, and
Yeah.
it shows, yes, from the river to the sea, all the way down to the Red Sea, and then you've got Gaza included in that. You've
Yeah.
got
That's the
what became the
right.
West Bank is included in that.
Yeah.
So, but those were not given to the Jews. Those areas were not given to the Jews for the state of Israel in 1948.
Yeah, so I mean, again, so you're leaping from 1917 to 1948. There's a lot of water that has to flow under the bridge
Sure.
between that happen. But why is this issue will gain importance, and it's already being talked about, as you know, the International Court of Justice is now hearing the case. And hearing the case mean not only what is happening right now in Gaza, it is to contextualize how has this come about. And all of this issue is being raised and will have to be addressed. The point of my paper is that the Balfour Declaration had no legal standing. There is no legality. It was a declaration of a government, of a cabinet, not even a government. It was not put into a vote in the British Parliament. Well, then the British Parliament is, again, like the Canadian Parliament, what the Parliament decides. That is Parliament is sovereign, but what the Parliament decides is what the cabinet tells the Parliament to decide. The
It's
majority.
true. It was just a note from Balfour to Rothschild,
So
but it like Herzl's book, it was the pebble in the pond.
it is the
And from that, you get to San Remo, and from that, you get to the League of Nations, to the United Nations, to the State of Israel, right? It may
right.
not have been a legal document, I
Yes,
grant you that.
legal standing. The legal standing is now going to be tested at the League of Nations, because that's where the president has come, where others have come. A covenant has been created, agreed upon, and signed. And now, the legality, that is international law, is coming into play. The League of Nations has established the Permanent Court of International Justice as part of the League of Nations. League of Nations is integrated into the Treaty of Paris, the Paris Conference. So all of this is the umbrella within which the formation of the post-war Europe and post-war world is going to take place, right? And the legality will then become established, okay? The King Crane Commission was part of that because it was sent by the League, the Inter-Allied Commission, to investigate, and it comes back. But all of that got derailed. One, because the Senate, under Republican majority, denied President Wilson the Treaty of Paris. So if we are talking about speculation, let us also speculate that if the treaty had been approved by the Senate, President Wilson would be sitting in Paris, or his appointed representative would be sitting in Paris, the Secretary of State, and so on and so forth, would be sitting in Paris. And what Balfour just now said, it doesn't matter who says what, you know, we have decided. Well, we don't know what President Wilson would have decided. President Wilson had gone along with the Balfour Declaration. But then President Wilson's own commission was coming back with the report from the Arab population of the Turkish Empire saying, hands down, you cannot do this. You know, there's no support for this. And there is no Jewish population in the Middle East, in Palestine. As we have just discussed, there's only 65,000 Jews compared to 700,000 Arabs in
And
the
a lot of them didn't want a state.
and they don't want the state. Exactly. Some do, but the majority don't, you know. So given all of that, we can only speculate what President Wilson might have said. He might have said, no, this cannot happen, you know. So there is no legal standing of the Balfour Declaration. And yet, the Palestine Mandate was transformed into implementing the Balfour Declaration. How and why? Well, how is Balfour and his Prime Minister, Lloyd Douglas, they inserted the Balfour Declaration into Article 22 at the San Remo Conference in April 1920. The San Remo Conference was a conference of the Executive Council. The Executive Council comprised of the main powers, Britain, France, Italy, and America. But America was at San Remo only an observer because America was not a member of the League anymore. So in San Remo, Britain inserted the Balfour Declaration into Article 22 of the League of Nations, all right, without any legality, without any vote, without it being presented to the General Assembly, the League Council, all right? And the British ran the British mandate as if it was their territory, not that Britain was a trustee. So it behaved as if it is their territory. They will do what it wants to do. And what they want to do is to establish a Jewish state. And as I just said, any state requires two things, a territory and a population. Well, the territory is now there, the the Palestine Mandate. That is the territory, but it has no population. And so that's the open door immigration into Palestine, while the possibility of the European Jews immigrating to to territories outside of Europe, but not to Palestine. Remember, when the Jews of Europe had the opportunity to go to Palestine of their own accord as immigrant, religious immigrant, and so on, or go elsewhere, they all chose to go to America. The largest number of Jews that left Europe between 1880 and the beginning of World War I was for America. But after World War I, immigration, the door was closed. From about 1920 till 1945, door was closed. The door was again open in the 1960s with the new Immigration Act, you know, after the assassination of President Kennedy. So these are long and complex issue, but the point is that in Palestine in 1919, 1920, there were not enough Jews to make a state. And so that's the whole process begins of bringing the Jews in from Europe into Palestine between 1920 and 1945, when the Second World War ends. And this was done by the British and under British power. And so the question comes out now, what what power did Britain have? This was a total scam. It was totally illegal. Because what happened after 1945, when the war ends, this period between 1945 and 1948 is, again, a very difficult period, not only for Britain worldwide, but for Palestine. Because on the one side, Britain goes through another change in government, just as it happened in America. In 1945, at the end of the war, Winston Churchill calls for an election, and his government is defeated, and the Labour government comes into power. The Labour government have completely different ideas about Zionism or about empires or about mandates. Because immediately, as the Labour government of Clement Attlee comes to power in 1945, its first announcement is that it's going to leave India, give India independence and leave. And they set the date for the departure from India in 1947. Oh, sorry, 1948, but then they move it forward to 1947. The next thing they do, because now the war has ended in Europe, the story of the Holocaust, of the disaster that has struck European Jews is now coming out in the paper. People are wanting to move, people are wanting to immigrate, or get them out, what is called the displaced person. Where are they going to go? Remember, in the period 1920, 1945, the doors to America is closed. Even though America supported the Balfour Declaration, that is President Wilson, America did not open the door to the Jews of Europe to come to America. Neither did Canada.
No, anti-Semitism is historic and rampant. But here's something that struck me in reading your article, Salim. All of this new information to me coming into my mind to try to form an opinion about the establishment of Israel. Is it just? Is it right? Is it moral? And I think if you ask the person on the street their impressions of Israel, they might think, okay, Israel, Jews were persecuted, Jews were exterminated during the Second World War, gassed and burnt by the millions. So therefore, and then they move down to Israel, and therefore the state of Israel is a just place to place the Jews because of the persecution they received in memorable history. I'm talking Second World War. But from reading your articles, a couple of Substacks on this, and also reading Herzl's book and other things, you get an impression that this is not a 1945, 1948 invention. This goes back 1,500 years or more of pressures upon the Jewish people, the assimilated Jews in Europe especially, not so much the indigenous Jews of Palestine. And all of a sudden you get a tapestry of history of that particular area, which gets so complex, though if you pull on one thread of that tapestry, you're not seeing the big picture. If you take out one thing, in the Holocaust, for example, or the San Remo, or the Balfour Declaration, you're not seeing the big picture. You're not seeing the historical pressures and vectors that went into making up this land we call Israel. So a question for you would be that all of this is his history, but is it moot? Is it just debatable? Is it academic? Can we just talk about this without bringing it to today's events in Gaza or in the West Bank or to blockades and boycotting Israel and all these things? Let's go from all these historical things and make a connection to today to see how history can help us in understanding the issue that is befalling the Gazans, especially today. How do you make that connection, Salim?
Well, I mean, you say how it is moot, Well, it
I'm
is moot.
asking the question, is it moot?
Oh, is it moot? Yeah. Well, it is moot in the following sense. When there is a dispute, the dispute that is taking place, I mean, it can be, going back to the Old West, two guys, get into a showdown and they're going to, what is it called? Have a duel, and, a quick gun draw. And so uh, at the end of the draw, there's a guy dead, presumably. So a dispute, it leads to a duel, and there's one guy dead. Now, how do you, well, number one, try to understand what has happened? Was the duel simply the fact of a dead man, or the duel was the end game of a dispute that has a historic past? Yes, so duel happened and there's a guy dead. Well, why did that duel happen? Because there was a dispute. Well, what was the dispute about? It could be a fraction of a time, or it could be a length of a time over which the dispute occurred. Uh, the quarrel took place, the argument happened, and so on. So to understand that is to go into history. History of any dispute can be, as to quote you, a tapestry where you pull one thread and the other thread comes about, or it can be a single thread, and that's not a problem, right? The nature of the dispute that we are talking about in Gaza today has a history that is not simple, because it is so many different actors that are involved in it, principally the great actors, the great powers. As I said again in my Substack, and it's simple point. Herzl died in 1904. His idea of the Jewish state, or his idea of anti-Semitism, would have remained a marginal issue in the lives of European Jews. We're not talking about Jews outside of Europe. There's a very big or significant Jewish population outside of Europe, in the Arab world, in India, in Africa, and so on and so forth. There are there. So it is a European problem, European great powers, and so on and so forth. Herzl died in 1904, and it would have been remain in the margin of history among the European Jews. You and I wouldn't be talking about this today. Nobody would be spending time on this matter. It would be a curiosity issue for anybody, wanting to study the life of European Jews for whatever period you want to study, And so matter would have ended. But the matter did not end, because the idea of a Jewish state and the making of Zionism, which was something that got Herzl occupied with, took on a life of its own as a result of the great powers picking up on it in the Great War of 1914-18. So that is why, all of this thing has to be taken into account, which is what is going to be taken into account and is going to be heard and is being heard at the International Court of Justice when the case was brought by the South Africans. Well, interestingly, just as a little digression, South Africa. Now, the Jews had immigrated to South Africa too, large number of them, because South Africa was a colony of the British Empire, just like Canada is, just like Australia and New Zealand. Yeah. Well, what happened to those Jews in South Africa? Well, some of the most significant players, actors in the struggle of the South African people against apartheid were supported by, engaged with, and participated in by Jews of South Africa, born and bred. I mean, there are any number of people who were close to Nelson Mandela, who played an immensely important role as either member of the South African, during the apartheid years, member of the South African National Assembly. People like Helen Suzman. She was a South African Jew whose parents had migrated from Lithuania, if I remember. There's Nadine Gordimer, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Her parents migrated from Latvia, South African Jew. Joe Slovo, who was the head of the South African Communist Party. He was from Estonia, I believe. And he was a close comrade of Nelson Mandela. Ruth First, she was also from one of the Baltic states, her parents. She was assassinated by the apartheid regime because of her work for the anti-apartheid cause. So here's an example of Jews in South Africa who were not in South Africa to create a Jewish state, who were there, who became South Africans, and who participated in ultimately bringing down the apartheid state and are living in South Africa, are members of the South African society and South African institution, and so on and so forth. And there are similar Jews among Palestine who have remained opposed to the whole idea of the Zionist state and who have worked and continue to work for a binational Palestine state of everyone equal, Jews and Arabs, Christian, Muslim, Jews, everyone, just as in South Africa. So the issue of the Jewish state, Balfour Declaration, and what we have now, Israel, is a result of the great powers. It's not a result of Herzl. I think that has to be clearly understood. I will make one other point, because we are in the election year right now in America, November 2024. We know who is going to be the Republican candidate as of now. There can be accident, there can be derailments, there can be assassination. But if we go by the numbers, we know that Donald Trump will be the nominee for the Republican Party. We also know it is very likely, unless they do some sort of a flip, the Democratic National Convention, that Joe Biden will be the president, the nominee. And so they will do. Well, here you have it. You have in Washington the most powerful lobby on this issue is AIPAC, the American Israel Public Action Committee. And they have got the entire Congress in their grip. They have got both the president in their grip. The Biden administration has been a neocon administration run by American Jews from top to bottom. The largest number of appointees in the Biden administration have been American Jews. The Secretary of State is Tony Blinken, and we can go down the list, You have the vice president, her husband, Douglas Emhoff, is an American Jew and a Zionist, So there you have the vice president and her husband. You have the nominee who was the president is going to be the nominee of the Republican Party, who similarly committed, as Balfour said, it doesn't matter what the people think. We, the great powers, are committed to Zionism and Zion and Zionism. And so there it is. Donald Trump is committed to it. Donald Trump's closest advisor is his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a Zionist Jew, an American. His daughter is a converted Jew. Well, where is the parallel? All of this discussion in 1916, 1917, 1918, 1919 is taking place in London and in Washington. Well, the Zionists have their connection to the leading members of the British War Cabinet in London. They're talking to them. They're influencing them. They're influencing Lloyd Douglas. Douglas Lloyd, or the prime minister's name is a confusing name, but the British War prime minister, and Arthur Balfour. They're talking to the president of United States, Woodrow Wilson, through his close friend who he appoints to the Supreme Court as Associate Justice, Louis Brandeis. I hope I got the name right. Louis Brandeis is the Zionist representative in America. So where are the Arab representatives where it matters, which is where the difference matters, that is London and Washington? There's no Arab representative, whether Christian or Muslim. So the decisions are made over the Arabs on Arab land. There's Palestine, where there are 700,000 Palestinian Arabs compared to 65,000 Jews and a minuscule Zionists. But the decision is being made in London and then in Washington, and it doesn't matter what the people on the land think, right? The decision is being made right now in Washington and in London and in Ottawa. It doesn't matter what the people in that part of the world think. So while empires are gone, imperialism has remained as an idea and as a practice. Okay, so this is where history matters. It is moot. And an impartial court, whether there's such a court that exists or doesn't exist, is another discussion. But the expectation is for the people that an impartial court will look at all the evidences and say, where an unlawful act was committed, illegality prevails, and therefore it must be corrected. What does justice mean? Justice means correcting what is unlawful, what is illegal. So yes, your point might makes a fact. That's exactly what the Americans say. We are the great power, we decide, and the rest will follow. That's rule-based order, provided they have the might to do it. In the case of Britain, they got the Palestine Mandate inserted into, the Balfour Declaration inserted into the Palestine Mandate, which was totally illegal and has no legal basis and foundation. 30 years later, the Zionists were shooting up the British. They bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was the head office of the British Mandate. They killed the representative. They assassinated the representative of the British government in the Middle East, based in Cairo, Lord Moyne. They then subsequently assassinated the UN representative that was sent to Palestine to look into the situation as a result of the announcement by Ben-Gurion in 1948, May 1948, and the subsequent aftermath of that. And they assassinated him, Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden. All right? There were killings of British soldiers. So what did the Britain do? Britain basically, as this crisis was developing and unfolding, it basically threw the mandate to the United Nations. Say, we're getting out. They had done an illegal act in 1919, 1920. That is the San Remo Conference, where they inserted the Balfour Declaration into Article 22 of the League of Nations. Because a mandatory award was a trusteeship given to a great power to hold the area for the duration of the time needed for the people to get ready to become independent and sovereign on their own. And instead of, therefore, holding in trust Palestine, the land in which 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were living for generations, going way back to the Crusade and before the Crusade, instead of maintaining the trust, which was the requirement of the League of Nations, they started the process of emptying the land. That is where the quote of Herzl becomes intriguing, because you have to get rid of the 700,000 Arabs to create a Jewish state. Well, that is what Bibi Netanyahu is doing. That is what basically Yitzhak Rabin finally woke up to realize that this is unsustainable. So let us sign the Oslo Accord and let us fulfill what the UN resolution states, two states in the Palestine mandate, an Arab state and a Jewish state. So let's sign the Oslo Accord. Let's hand over the occupied territories for the making of an Arab state. What did the Likudniks, the ultra right wing Jews, Jewish nationalists, and the settlers, what did they do? They assassinated the man who agreed upon the UN Resolution 181. All right. So it is moot. It is so moot that the question was raised only a couple of days ago by the Senate Majority Leader in the US Senate, Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer said that if the thing continues as it is continuing, I have the words of Chuck Schumer here, I noted it down, that the manner in which Bibi Netanyahu is going has been willing, too willing, to tolerate the civilian toll in Gaza, which is pushing support for Israel to worldwide historic lows. Israel cannot survive if it becomes a pariah. The Chinese foreign minister, only a few weeks ago, after America once again vetoed a UN Security Council resolution to bring about a humanitarian ceasefire, he said, what is happening in Gaza is a disgrace to civilization. So if the argument is, and the argument has a lot of support behind it in terms of Western public opinion, that the Holocaust and the destruction of European Jews required a Jewish state, and so the Israel was created, and that's right. Okay, so that was the public opinion upon which Truman acted and others acted, including the Canadian government, after having said one Jew is one too many to come to Canada. That's Mackenzie King acted. Then it is public opinion again that will act in a manner in which, to what Chuck Schumer is saying, is Israel will not survive as a pariah state.
You have to hand it to the Zionist lobby and to the entire Jewish population who created Israel that their plan succeeded. At least for 3 generations, it was a resounding success. They have the state of Israel. It is well armed and it can defend itself. But I think its Achilles heel is what you just brought up. If it no longer is able to get the support of the world, the population of the United States, or the United States government, what does it fall back on? Its munitions would run out. If it doesn't have the support of states like the United States or Canada or the United Kingdom, then we will not be funding it. We will not be giving it munitions. It will implode. It will dissolve, or it may be forced to sit down at the negotiating table with its neighbors and negotiate some sort of lasting solution to it that may or may not involve the state of Israel. I can't see them giving it up ever. However, I'm not in high diplomacy. I have no idea what goes on behind closed doors. So it's a fascinating area. I think that you've made the case that history is not simply moot. It's not debatable. It's not just academic. It does have real life today consequences, and it is germane to our discussion to understand exactly how the state came to being, how Gazans got to be where they are, how Israel got to have the borders that it does, why it's involved in the West Bank, etc., etc. History has to be understood today in the Middle East. Salim, I think we'll cut it there because this has been a wonderful discussion about an area that interests me, and that is motivation and history and ethics and morality. But at the end of the day, I mean, for the Israelis, it's might makes right, notwithstanding anything that went before. Today, to them, might makes right. I don't know how long that'll last, though. So, do you want the last word, Salim, on that particular point? Might makes right.
Well, well, the last point is basically what you mentioned, and I will reiterate. Um, when there is a dispute, or where there is a dispute, there can be no settlement outside of its history. That is the history of the dispute. You know, the settlement has to take place within the context of that history. So the history is the history of Palestine, 1917 to where we are now, 110 years later, 107 years later. It might go on for a few more years, but the settlement will come within the context of that history. And that context is, as I pointed out, it was based upon a falsehood, falsus in uno. It was based upon a falsehood. And then to protect that falsehood, or to maintain that falsehood and to sustain that falsehood, more and more and more falsehoods were piled upon. And so where we have arrived at is falsehood magnified to the nth degree. And of course, the International Court of Justice, unraveling that falsehood, as you said, pulling one thread is going to unravel the whole thing, because all will fall apart, And that was known right from the beginning. One person that you did not mention, which is so important in all of this discussion, was the lone Jewish member of the British War Cabinet in 1917. The lone Jewish member, an Anglo-Jew, was Edwin Montagu. Edwin Montagu was a cabinet member. He was an English Jew. He was the Secretary of State for India at the time in 1917. And he wrote in response to the letter that was being circulated among the members of the cabinet by the Prime Minister, the one that he authorized Lord Balfour to write to Rothschild, which we all now know, the eventual letter that came out. So it was being circulated to get the consensus of everyone on board. There was one opposition, and that one opposition was by the lone Jewish member of the War Cabinet, Edwin Mont, and he rejected it completely. And he laid out the argument. He said, Jews are not a nation. Judaism is a religion. It is not a nation. And from there it flowed. So see, again, falsus in uno, everything else was false. And he was concerned about what would be the consequences.
I wonder how many people have ever heard his name. They're out there chanting from the river to the sea. They don't know what river. They don't know what sea. Do they know Montague? Do they know Balfour? Do they know any of these little snippets of history that you're bringing forward in your Substack article, which I would encourage people to go to? I'll put it in the description and on the video where you can go to Salim's Substack. Thank you, Salim. This is a wonderful discussion. I understand that it's going to be up to people like you, scholars, historians, history, and the International Court of Justice to decide whether or not the actions of Israel today are beyond the pale. Thank you, Salim.